Okay, I think we're ready to go. So welcome everyone. We are the Black Asian Minority Ethnic Educators Network, the BAMED network. As of last month, we are a charity now, a grassroots movement to support important work that needs to be done to make sure that our education system reflects our society and our global world. And this is the third of our Courageous Conversations About Race series. And today's session will be looking at curriculum. And we have esteemed panel members with us today. Liz Pemberton has a rich background in nursery education and is director of the Black Nursery Manager. Ben Mearhart is deputy head teacher at Gordon Children's Academy and team member at the Black Curriculum. And Domini Leong is Deputy Head Teacher at Cottam School and Chair of the BAMED Bristol and Southwest Hub. And the running order today, we will go according to phase. We will give each of our panelists up to 10 minutes to set out their thoughts. We know that a key part of the journey towards becoming an anti-racist institution is to look at curriculum, and much thought goes into a school curriculum in terms of sequencing, key skills and knowledge, building towards exams and more. And the question we're grappling with is how we create a curriculum that is inclusive and tells the true story of the British experience and that prepares our students to be global citizens. You'll be able to engage in chat, and there's also a Q&A section where you can put in specific questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. We have alongside us also Amjad Ali, who is on the steering group and a trustee of the BAMED network. And in amongst you in the chat, we have other members of our steering group. Thanks so much. So I'll hand over first of all to Liz.
Thank you so much, Penny. Thank you, Amjad. And really warm welcome to everybody that's here this evening. My name is Liz Pemberton. And as Penny said, I have worked in early years, primarily nursery education, for the past 16 years. More recently, I've set up an anti-racist consultancy and training called the Black Nursery Manager, really to address some of the things that I feel are overlooked when it comes to having conversations about anti-racist practice, primarily for children under 5 in a range of early years settings. So that may be in private day nurseries, it may be in nurseries that are parts of chains, it might be in the local mother and toddler group, or it might be in a nursery school. But what I really want to kind of dig into is how attitudes and perceptions of Black, South Asian, East and Southeast Asian children, how perceptions of those children under 5 can impact their future learning and development as they go through the education, or what I commonly call the miseducation system. This was kind of really born out of the work that I had done as a nursery manager. I worked for the family business, which at the time was one of 3 children's day nurseries. And that nursery was located in Birmingham on a border of one of the most affluent areas of Birmingham and one of the most quote unquote deprived, under-resourced areas in Birmingham. They were Edgbaston and Ladywood. And my nursery sat very comfortably and straddled those 2 areas. But the demographic of the children I had coming in were all from what would be classified as the inner cities of Birmingham. So it meant that the cohort of children I'd had throughout the time that I was there were always Black, African, Caribbean and South Asian. At any one time, I would probably have 1 or 2 white British children. And I started to look at the pattern of the children who would come into the setting. Also throughout that time, we were graded various judgments from Ofsted, depending on how the inspector felt on the day, from inadequate to outstanding and everything in between. So when I looked at how judgments were kind of reached, I noticed that terms like diversity were used or terms like inclusion were used. There was nothing specifically about how we managed or looked at anti-racism within the activities or the training or the energy that was injected into the setting as a whole. So I really looked at that in terms of practitioner development and also what we did with the local community in terms of engaging that local community to allow the children in our setting to see themselves reflected, not just in the immediate setting, but outside as well, and really worked on ensuring an absolute positive sense of self, making sure that we incorporated everything that we did with the texts that we had or the guidance that we had, whether that be statutory or non-statutory. We looked at ways that we could incorporate this and explicitly pull out things that would ensure that all of the children didn't just feel seen, didn't just feel like they were part of a wider community, but felt proud of who they were within their families, within their communities, and within the nursery setting as well. So as a visibly Black woman, I always thought about my position as not only a nursery manager, but somebody who was managing a nursery that was part of my Black family, my mother being the proprietor and the overall general manager, if you like, and also managing 3 nurseries that one was in Birmingham local authority, the other 2 were in Sandwell. And so I realized how important it was to have that level of representation, not just within management, but also within the recruitment decisions I was making for the practitioners that were with me for that 16 years. So I just thought about how that impacted those Black and brown. For the purpose of this evening, I'll use the brown term for children of a South Asian heritage. I thought about what that did in terms of solidifying positive messages, feelings of being seen and being represented, that it was much more about what they were seeing in terms of real life, as well as resources. You know, books, Black dolls, all of those things were important. Of course, they were secondary. The most important resources that I thought needed to be in early year settings were the people, and that the people fairly represented the range of multiracial members of society, community, and more specifically Birmingham, that city. So it's driven me onto the path to look at consultancy and training so that I can kind of roll out some of the things that I did in the setting over the time that I was there. So further support, I guess, other early years practitioners, other early years managers, as to how we can make sure that our curriculum is not only inclusive, but that the guidance that we are given is used appropriately to impact children who are minoritized, children who are marginalized, and children who further on in their journey throughout education might not be represented in the way that I feel that they should.
Thank you. We're going to hand over to Ben.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I hope you and your families are very well. Just a little bit about me. I'm on the team of the Black curriculum. I've been teaching for about 18 years now. In that time, I've taught from rising threes all the way up to year 11 and 16-year-olds. And I've been a senior leader for the last 11 years. In recent times, I've been volunteering for Firstly Show Racism the Red Card as an educator and consultant, particularly focusing on their sessions with children and teacher training. And then about 2 years ago, I started working with Think Equal, which is an early years based charity that they've developed, a social emotional learning program that focuses on attacking unconscious bias while it's still forming and while the brain is at its most beautifully elastic. And then more recently, I've been volunteering for the Black curriculum, heavily involved in the recent 365 campaign, and I've authored a curricular charter for a Manchester constituency, and more recently I was part of the Labour Party's education roundtable as well. So I had quite a broad experience. And on a more personal level, I've just completed a 30-week course on an introduction to Black studies in terms of Black history, psychology, sociology, politics, music, and art. Which I wish I learned from, well, as soon as I started nursery. I wish I had even a fifth of that information when I first started. And I'm really grateful and welcome this opportunity to have this conversation, but also to be courageous. I think that's particularly key. So I'm going to be as direct as I possibly can. And my starting point, and I'd like to share my starting point and some perspectives that I try to keep in mind. with this vital work. First of all, that I'm determined to move away from merely articulating the problem. I want to focus on practical things that are actually going to make a difference and a sustained and positive change. And for me, I came across a quotation from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which, forgive me if you've already heard, which I'm going to say twice because I think it bears repeating. She defines racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So I'll say it one more time. Racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So we're not just talking, in my eyes, about the day-to-day experiences of people. We're talking about their trajectories, their life chances, and equally for their family and their wider family and their futures. And I like to keep that thought process in mind when I'm approaching the value of this work. And I also keep in mind something that's been attributed to Winston Churchill, where he said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And I think that's particularly key when we're thinking about the sources of history and the powers that be in terms of history. So those are the perspectives I try to keep in mind, and please do ignore any suggestions I have or make that stray from those realities. That's what I'd like to keep in mind. And in terms of the Black curriculum, we borrow from Angela Davis in terms of we don't think it's enough to not be racist or even to be anti-racist. We believe you need to be racially literate, and that's what we're aiming to support. In terms of our guiding principles, we've got sort of three core guiding principles for our education standards, which is something I developed just recently over the summer. The first, in terms of the first massive mission of the Black curriculum that these standards support, is to provide a sense of belonging and identity to young people. In terms of our standards, we want to support schools to firstly define and to deal with racism, so you know what you're dealing with, and you're in a position to define and address it. And for us to be colorblind, as in I don't see color, we're all the same and so on, actually is to be color mute, and that genuinely denies that the lived experiences of those subjected both interpersonal and structural and systemic racism. Well, we want schools to communicate not just with an awareness of the diversity of the audience that they're addressing, but with awareness of the messages they're reinforcing each time they speak, each choice that they make. We want to evolve beyond vital racial diversification of our curricula and workforce, and move towards a genuinely, authentically racially literate and anti-racist school community. Our second key aim is to teach an accessible educational Black British history curriculum that raises attainment for young people. And so this is where we want to support schools to address racialized underachievement, deviancy, absence and tardiness, and as we'll go into, I'm sure later, to remove the blinkers of colonized and Eurocentric history curriculum pedagogy. And what I think is particularly key in terms of supporting this is to support staff and the students that they teach to engage critically with and challenge how knowledge has been created, the authors, their perspectives, the relationships, the legacies, the power relations at play, and the hierarchies, and to interrogate the ties between history's ultimately prejudiced hierarchies and today's systemic inequalities. And I think that it's fascinating that there's more and more focus on fake news in terms of education, and yet I think there's a strong case to argue that a lot of the history, certainly that I was taught as a child, could well be classified as fake news in many ways. And in terms of phrasing attainment, we want to explore worldviews that preceded the European empires, and why and how these views later became marginalized and are still marginalized today. And our third overarching principle is to improve social cohesion between young people across the UK. So this for us is moving beyond just articulating and evidencing disparity and disadvantage, and moving towards action that supports authentic change and agency for those young people, and ultimately equal opportunity. And as I touched upon a few moments ago, we're prioritising practical, proactive choices that target the barriers that need to be addressed in order for change to be sustainable. And a key part of this is cultivating, firstly, critical thinking, but also intersectional empathy. So for those who are unfamiliar with the term in terms of intersectionality, the idea here is that you're focusing on the personal characteristics that make up a person's individual context. So if you are both Black and female, the compounding impact of experiencing not just sexism for your gender, but also racism for your race, and how you're experiencing those social constructs. In terms of our teacher training and the work we do with schools, we focus on 3 key areas. The leadership of the school, which I think is key. If we're going to address anything in schools, I think more than the curriculum personally, or indeed the learning and the language, leadership is key. So we're looking to establish a racially literate culture, a community that's driven by the teachers. The learning, so the decolonising the curriculum, and the pedagogy, I think that's equally key. Not just the content, it's how it's been delivered and provided and engaged and interacted with. And we're, from our point of view, we're looking to embed Black history, and particularly Black British history, in that curriculum. And then I think the key, if we're addressing dehumanisation, which is I think what we're talking about, then the language is essential. But it's racially literate language, is intersectionally empathetic and inclusive language. I hope I'm still okay for the time-ish. I'm getting a nod, that's good. Okay, so I wanted to take advantage of this chance now, just in case I bore you to tears and I lose you later on. So I'm going to go with the hot stuff now, in my opinion. There's some things that, if you are thinking about doing something now in terms of improving the curriculum from an anti-racist point of view, certainly for those in the UK, but anyone, I think, across the world, firstly, to take advantage of the flexibility within your current national curriculum. In the UK, ours is, to my mind, it's a bluff, but still that we could call that bluff in terms of there is flexibility there, not least in terms of there are non-statutory examples which a brave school would defy, but still the option is there, and certainly from the Black curriculum's perspective. When we were speaking to the powers that be earlier in the year, that was often the rebuttal in terms of the curriculum already is sufficiently flexible. So call them on that, so that we don't need the government to change their rulings and their guidance in terms of the curriculum. Take advantage of the flexibility that's there. More practically still, I would really implore you to look at who within your schools directly influences your pedagogy and your curriculum, to actually do a breakdown of who influences how your school teaches and the curriculum content. Is it the head teachers, the deputy head teacher, the subject leaders? Is it racial literacy ambassadors? And what proportions do they have? And then, from our point of view, this enables you to review the degree of influence afforded by each of those decision makers, and then the overall balance of the makeup of this group. And through gaining these types of insights, you can actively minimize pedagogical and curricular bias and inequality and discrimination. And consequently, I think a much better place to provide the students with a rounded, rich and accurate understanding of their identity, but also their history. Okay, and the last thing I'll say, so that I then can move on, in terms of this, is that I think that it's vital, given the significant change that's required, that it's done in meaningful partnership with the staff and the students and indeed the wider community, so that you can regularly review and rethink and reframe and reconstruct how you shape and implement your curriculum. And the actress Kerry Washington said something which I read about a couple of months ago, and it really spoke to me. She said, "I'm not interested in living in a world where my race is not a part of who I am. I'm interested in living in a world where our races, no matter what they are, don't define our trajectory in life." And I think that, to me, is what we're particularly talking about. And to end finally on something slightly controversial, but I think key, is that if, as a leader in education, if I proposed in my school that the toilets and drinking fountains should be segregated along racial lines, if I was to do that, there would be outrage invariably. I'd lose my job pretty quickly. And yet, if you were, to my mind, if you're looking objectively, certainly in our country, if you're looking at the curricular content, if you're looking at leadership structures, if you're looking at the agency afforded our students, if you're looking at ultimately student life trajectories, to me, are those things not in reality currently segregated along racial lines? And that to me is what we need. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben. Over to you, Domini.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time so close to Christmas to attend, which is a testament to your absolute commitment to improving the educational experiences of the young people in your institutions. I'm just going to say a little bit about my background. I grew up in an all-white home counties town in the 80s and 90s, a dual heritage child of immigrants. So I and my family faced a lot of racism. I rapidly built my career teaching in London, and then I moved to the Southwest about 12 years ago, which was a massive culture shock in terms of career progression opportunities at senior leadership if you're not from around here. At the time, I was one of only 2 Black or Asian senior leaders in Bristol and possibly in the whole of the Southwest. I remember early on in my time here, a Black male drama teacher who had been born, raised and worked his whole life in Bristol said to me one day, "I never thought a Black or Asian person could become a senior leader in education until I met you," which I found a really shocking thing to hear. And my experiences in the Southwest was cemented even further by quite a traumatic experience a few years ago of having to take the stand in a tribunal against someone I did not know, who tried to suggest that I was given my job at that time, a job that they felt should have been theirs because of the colour of my skin, and that I received favourable treatment all the time as a result of the colour of my skin. Those experiences and that of the mountain I had to climb to progress my career in the region led to a personal commitment from me to lift up and mentor aspiring BAME leaders in the profession, and more recently through chairing the BAME Ed Bristol and Southwest network to support trusts and schools in the region to effect strategic change through their policies and practices towards race equity in education. Now I'm a deputy head teacher at a truly comprehensive multicultural school, and working with a head teacher and senior team who are really committed and passionate about our work on race equity. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about now comes from the work that we've done at our school. So the first thing I wanted to really talk about was why it's so important to decolonize and culturally diversify our curriculum. And I'll refer to the Black Curriculum report that's coming out or has come out. And in it, it talks about how attempts to modernize the history national curriculum in particular have provoked widespread controversy, which has challenged the idea of what British history should entail and which narratives should comprise this history, something which Ben talked about quite a bit just now. And for me, that is really saying that what we teach our young people in society is has become a victim of identity politics, arising out of the fear of diluting a historic concept of Britishness that's been fueled even more recently by nationalist and populist rhetoric. And our moral imperative should be to teach the truth in as accurate a way as possible. And obviously, what that truth is what is being debated at the moment, but I don't believe it is what the current national curriculum is. And teaching Black history, the Black Curriculum Report also says that teaching Black history not only benefits Black students, but it's beneficial to British society as a whole. And I think that could not be more relevant and important given our current social and political events that are happening in Britain and around the world. And recently, I was speaking to some school leaders in the Southwest region, and I became aware that, or they described an area where a Black or brown face is a rare sight, and they were pondering, just putting it out there, the relevance of this work for their schools, particularly when they are facing so many other pressures this year. My response is always around the moral imperative that all school leaders have towards a broad education for their students, to develop their students as critical thinkers who are equipped to be citizens of a multicultural world, and to recognise that, in fact, Black and Asian ethnic groups are in fact the global majority, not the minority, and understanding that and what that means and our place in the world is important for all students, whatever their background. And so, you know, as a question I ask a lot of schools is, do white students have a good knowledge about each subject that they're taught in relation to its place and contribution on the global stage, rather than simply a Western Eurocentric view of the subject? And if you can't say that they do, where are the knowledge gaps in relation to that? I'm just going to talk briefly about how we might go about decolonising and culturally diversifying our curriculum, and some of the work we've done at my current school. So I believe strongly that it's a deep process of curriculum overhaul for all subjects that needs to be undertaken, not a superficial bolt on, and not just the history curriculum. And looking at some of the comments in the chat, I can see that there are people who are asking questions around that. But in order to do that, time, real proper time must be committed, and taking the view that this is a marathon, not a sprint. So at my current school, we took this to mean working very deeply on 1 year group's curriculum each year, and uprooting the curriculum completely and going back to the drawing board. But alongside that, there needs to be work around everyday anti-racist teaching practice, or quick wins, as we like to use in our profession. You know, things like ensuring that there are diverse representation in images, and the historical and recent achievements as well are diversely represented. Ensuring that English idioms are explained and not assumed. Modeling a range of accents that speak standard English. That's so important. It isn't always the English accent it is the right accent. You know, identifying colonial influences on Western nations, discussing them openly with students, for example, in food, in the spread of language, in music, etc. And being brave enough to openly discuss issues of hate crime, xenophobia, racism, and racial bias at any relevant opportunity, and linking them into current events. And there is a lot of fear around discussing those things. The groundwork needs to be laid through developing a school culture that's committed to changing the curriculum. So there has to be groundwork before you can just dive in and start, you know, upheaving your curriculum. And part of the groundwork that we did at my school is we did some work a couple of years ago now around addressing unconscious bias. We look at tackling the overrepresentation of BAME students in sanctions and discipline, you know, looking at restorative practice, having transparent discussions with staff about white privilege and anti-racism. That came much later, after initially starting with unconscious bias. It can be, when you have a predominantly white staff, quite a challenge to launch straight in to talk about racism, being anti-racist. And so we approached it in that way. At Cottam, at my school, we're committed to undertaking multiple aspects of this work at once. And one of the ways one of the tools we're using to help us do that is the Anti-Racist School Award, which is by CRED, the Centre for Race Education and Decoloniality at Leeds Beckett University. It's a really good framework to support us, because we believe that shifting culture cannot be done in a piecemeal and tokenistic fashion. It needs to be strategically driven with a clear vision and set of goals. And being the chair of BAMED for the Southwest forced me to consider the regional challenges and contexts that we face, and then more specifically the local challenges relevant to our school. And that's really important. The history and experiences of local communities and the school's own context are really important to unpick and look at as part of the work that you do. But another key part of the groundwork that needs to be done is something Ben already mentioned, the personal work that needs to be done by school leaders, because they hold that vision. And at my school, the senior leadership team are undertaking an 18-month race identity and school leadership program with Viv Grant and her team at Integrity Coaching, which involves many 3-hour workshops, a lot of self and group reflection and coaching. It is a highly emotive process for us to undertake that, but it's such an important one for senior leaders to be highly focused and cognizant of why we're doing this work. What is the impact we want to have on the culture of our school, and how do we go about it? In the Runnymede Trust in 2020, a report that they've produced talks about the reality is, and will continue to be, that the overwhelming majority of staff in UK schools are white. As such, it is imperative that they are part of the solution. And that's around developing the racial literacy and confidence of white teachers. It cannot be the BAME staff leading the way all the time. And we're tired of being the lone voices. You know, I've been working on these issues, as have many other BAME colleagues, for decades. At Cottam, our white head teacher, she models the way. She leads the work with me. She's open and transparent with staff about the ups and downs of the personal and emotive journey she is on to lead the school through this fundamentally important change of culture. And I just want to mention, that the BAME, the definition of BAME, which I know is very controversial, is not homogenous. So it does need to recognise the contributions and experiences of many groups within this. You know, colonial history offers this opportunity, leading to the contribution of Commonwealth countries, you know, bringing in the experiences and contributions of minority ethnic groups to the UK, such as Roma, Traveller and Gypsy, who face extreme prejudice and discrimination from all quarters. Ben mentioned the last point I want to make as well, which is around involving students and parents and how important that is. And for me, that's about a really deep process of involving them, having focus group discussions, because a questionnaire can be useful for a broad sense, but it really is around the discussions that get to the root of their views. Involving parents, you know, are they happy about the curriculum being taught, and how can they contribute? In Bristol, we have some parents with really deep knowledge of local African Caribbean history. So how can they be involved, for example? I'm going to stop there. So.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Liz, Ben and Domini. A very, very rapid and useful oversight and insight into curriculum, going from EYFS all the way to secondary. What I wanted to do is just summarize very, very quickly and then pose a question for you based on the chats and based on pre-questions that we've had. So Liz, I love the fact that you saw an issue and saw a gap and then pushed forward in making a difference and setting up a organization and a consultancy based network to be able to move that forward. And as everybody knows, and everybody that's involved in education that truly understands education will say, it all starts at EYFS, and understanding the groundworks, the foundations of EYFS is absolutely crucial in addressing the needs and addressing, as Ben said, when it's flexible, when the minds are flexible and when the minds can be able to bring in these issues and take on these issues. Ben, your overview is absolutely invaluable. The one thing that I've taken away solely from that, and this is a question I'd beg everybody to ask and find the answer out for in their schools, is who directly influences their curriculum. And actually using that kind of language is really powerful in thinking, who actually QAs it, who checks it, who says this is okay, this is right for us. And therefore, what background does that person have, and what insight does that person have, and what knowledge does that person bring to that role? And Dominique, you know, lots and lots of what you said has resonated, hence your involvement in BAME Southwest and being a fantastic chair in that network, in that regional group. The fact that you stated that we're tired of always raising these issues, and therefore it's on people to make a difference now. Penny and I have had many, many conversations where we say, is it for us to constantly teach you and educate you, or is it now a time for you to educate yourself and teach yourself? I think the question that I'd like to pose to all of you just leads on and follows on to a kind of, I've always taught my students that the best way to win an argument is to know the other side's argument better than your own, almost. So what are the common rebuttals? What are the common issues? What will people throw back at us if we say, actually, we want a diversification within the curriculum? And something that's often chucked at us is the fact that we don't want to dumb down the knowledge. We don't want people to not learn about the fantastic histories that the world has had to offer. And I guess what I'd love for the panel members to do is explore with the audience, how can we challenge that rebuttal? I mean, I have lots of examples of what you can say, but I'd love to hear from you in terms of anybody. Say, for example, I say to you, okay, Dominique, that's brilliant, but how can you take away that book that's in the canon and that's foundational to the successes of our students? Liz, how can we replace this in the EYFS strategies, in the EYFS curriculum? Because this is exactly what students need to know. And Ben, you talk about Black history. We have Black History Month. Isn't that enough? You know, what can we do to challenge that viewpoint that by adding this diversification, essentially we're losing rigor?
I just think one of the things that we have to be really mindful of, particularly in the early years and at EYFS, is avoiding this reductive approach to inclusion or anti-racism. And what's really commonly done in the EYFS is reducing things to a celebration of Chinese New Year, a celebration of Eid, a celebration of Diwali, right? Boxes have been ticked, we've done all we need to do now. Some of the rebuttals that I've had is that my setting is all white. We don't need to have these conversations, Liz. You know, we know what there is to know. And often I think about, well, whose knowledge is being propagated, whose truths are being told, who is informing the, you know, development matters documents that have come through, who is talking about why it's not appropriate actually to have Chinese New Year as something that's a tick box. Why are we still doing what we were doing in the 80s in 2020? What's happening to the voices of those children who are kind of being overlooked, or worse still, tokenized? So if you assume that somebody is from a particular racial group, if a child is, you know, in that assumptive group, well, you tell me what you do. You know, what does Eid mean to you? Because that child's from a South Asian background, not recognizing that that child may not be Muslim, you know, and who else celebrates Eid? Where are we going with racial literacy for early years staff? Are early years staff in a place where they feel like they can have conversations about difference that moves past, you know, ability and look specifically at race? So one of the things that I always do when I'm opening conversations is saying that we cannot have kindness to overshadow or stop us from having conversations about race, because race has been historically categorized as being unkind. To talk about race and to talk about difference in the early years is being unkind. And it feeds into this colorblind approach that the early years has really adopted well, mixed it with kindness, and then said, right, well, we've done what we need to do. And it's really, really destructive. And it's really problematic when we look at shaping the minds of children under 5, but also shaping a workforce in terms of giving them the confidence and the ability to understand that to talk about race and to talk about difference is not unkind. To talk about race and to talk about difference is actually empowering. For a child to have their home environment as the first place that they are learning about who they are, and having that place solidify and, you know, emphasize all of those positive elements of their racial identity, that too should be mirrored in the early years setting. From as early as 2 years old, 3 years old, these conversations should be had. So there isn't an assumption. I talk about the role play area, for instance, that we've got a hairdresser's role play and that's it, but we don't have any Afro combs in the hairdresser's role play. We don't have any silk bonnets in the hairdresser's role play, but I wear a silk bonnet when I go to sleep. And so it's important that I see that replicated with my earlier setting. In the same way, if we're looking at the kitchen area, and these are very practical, simplistic things, but in my kitchen role play area, are there Maggie cubes? You know, are there chopsticks as well as a knife and fork? Is there an assumption that we're going to use utensils to eat, cutlery to eat? Or are we encouraging that the fact children come from homes where they eat with their hands, it's very normalized? It shouldn't be looked at as something that is othered. And these are the little things that should be happening in early years practice, but should be recognised by the staff team, should be recognised by nursery owners, nursery managers, as rebuttals, that this is what we do. You're coming into an environment which absolutely respects anti-racist practice from the get-go. Yeah, so we have to respect children and their families and the choices that they make in terms of child rearing, which are directly linked to culture, which are directly linked to where they may have come from if they're not from the UK, and also how we value and support that inclusively. So we look at everything. We're not just saying the child's come into the early years setting, this is what we do here, the end. No, what do we do as a collective? So I just wanted to kind of put that in, because often people, for me, say, well, this doesn't start in the early years, but it absolutely does. And we can't escape that. It's absolutely essential that we don't just look at the guidance that we get from the government, the non-statutory guidance, the statutory guidance, and think, well, we're following everything to the T. Because I've looked at some of the guidance, and I've looked at the Development Matters guidance that's come out September 2020, and it suggests that children should learn about ethnic difference by putting on wigs. Not appropriate. You know, you putting on an Afro wig is absolutely not appropriate. It's actually racist. It's not what we should be encouraging practitioners to do. It isn't what we should be encouraging children under 5 to do, to learn about ethnic difference. And this is directly taken from, you know, documentation that is used to inform practice, albeit it's non-statutory. But we know what happens when documents come from the government. It gets put into practice and people take that as, you know, as the word. And that often is used as a rebuttal to some of the things that I do in terms of my consultancy and my training. Well, it says it in the guidelines, Liz. When I'm actually going in and saying, well, that's not what we do for inclusive role play. We do not try on Black people's hair. That's not what we do. In the same way that I don't want anybody in a role play setting dressing up as an Indian. And this is, you know, verbatim what I've been told. We dress up as Indians to celebrate Diwali. What does that even mean? So we really need to dig down into racial literacy to get practitioners aware of how harmful some of the language that they're using is, how inappropriate some of the activities that they are doing or planning, when activities are not based on observations of where the children are from, what they like to do, who they are as individuals. When we're recognizing the unique child, we fall into very dangerous territory. And that's why I believe firmly that anti-racist practice should be the thread throughout everything, and should be regarded in the same way that safeguarding is regarded, or regarded in the same way that SEN is regarded. Every early years setting is required to have, you know, somebody that's responsible for safeguarding, somebody who's responsible for SEN, who is responsible for anti-racist practice. You know, it shouldn't be optional. This is absolutely necessary, and it should be absolutely statutory.
I think, just touching on your points about the way it all starts, and Dominique mentioned about how it should be localized, and Ben mentioned about how actually our curriculum is fairly flexible in terms of what we're doing and how we can do it. It's just the worry about people thinking that by us diversifying the curriculum, we're losing that rigor. And as we all know, history in itself is diverse. We know that literature in itself is diverse, and we know that art in itself is diverse. So anybody that's feeling that actually by removing X, Y, Z, we're losing the academic standards is what I'd love for us to touch on. And I had a conversation with someone very recently about this, who said, but, you know, isn't it the case that actually there isn't as many Black scientists or as many Asian scientists? And actually the response was, they influenced many of the white scientists. I looked up the word quarantine, and it's associated with an Italian professor actually, but it was originated way before that. And so we love learning etymology of words and etymology of language within our English curriculum, but actually, do we learn the etymology of history? You know, where does it come from? If anybody wants to jump in on that.
Amjad, could I add something around the idea of dumbing down? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think for me, my view on decolonizing the curriculum is that it isn't just about addressing what was wrong in historical accounts, or as I call it, challenging the narrative. It's also about celebrating what is right, changing the narrative. And as Ben mentioned in his talk, about challenging how knowledge is created. And developing students' exploration and critical thinking around issues of social justice, their own rights and those of others, and giving them that vocabulary to do so is the complete opposite of dumbing down. If anyone watched the pre-session of resource by Alicia Lewis, she talks about the need to unlearn and relearn, and actually that's pretty high level. I don't think that that can be classed as dumbing down. I think that for the naysayers, one of the things that the approach that I've taken is around being really clear about the overall principles of your curriculum, and that the work you're doing around decolonisation and race equity sits within your overall principles. So, you know, we designed our principles, our curriculum needs to be ambitious. And what does that mean? You know, we are trying to develop cultural capital. What does that mean? We're recognizing diverse and Bristol's local history and achievements. We're thinking about big ideas in society and so on. And therefore, the work that you do on decolonising and culturally diversifying your curriculum would sit or should sit within a bigger vision of what your overall curriculum strives to achieve. And doing that gives it the weight and the importance it needs, because it's part of a wider curriculum review that schools should be undertaking anyway. So that was what I wanted to say on that.
And Ben, you were going to mention something?
Absolutely, thank you. You know, reinforcing very much what Dominic was saying there, I think in terms of intellectual and academic rigor, that unless we are explicitly teaching the children how to work with, challenge and synthesize diverse points of view, and including from an historical point of view, I don't think we are being academically rigorous. So I think that within appropriate and effective racial literacy provision, I think that's exactly what you have to be doing. You have to explicitly teach the children how to sympathise and work with different points of view. And I think that when you're doing that, and once they reach, as Dominic was touching upon, that level of effective critical engagement, I think it's almost impossible for the students to then be okay with just white male European Eurocentric sources for not just history, or indeed for literature, but across there. And what I would, again, building upon what Donnie was saying, I think that if as a school you're clear on your criteria for what is included in your curriculum, if you're clear on that criteria and you're equally committed to honouring that and adhering to it in terms of your choices, again, I don't think that you can approach that with any rigor if you're not looking to diversify the sources and the content in information. What I would also say, and this is maybe more personal than is helpful here, is that one of the reasons why I wish I'd learned what I've learned in the last year when I was from nursery onwards is that I started learning, thinking I'm going to be learning about other people's history so I can be more inclusive of their point of view. But ultimately, it's our history, and that's one of the rebuttals that I get a lot in terms of that's their history, not our history. But if you're going back to the contributions of the Nile Valley and pre-enslavement Africa, the contributions to civilization across the globe are phenomenal, and that, to my mind, is our history. And I'd argue anybody who wants to go back into that to see it differently. So to me, that's equally key.
I think Ben, maybe what people are trying to mention when they talk about losing rigor is actually, maybe if we flip it in this way, the people that you say are responsible for curriculum. So say, for example, I'm responsible for the English curriculum and I know X, Y, Z units of work, studies, authors, etc. Where the rigor argument comes in is actually me personally, because I don't know other histories as much as I know X, Y, Z. And therefore I feel that I'm dumbing down the curriculum because actually me personally, I don't have as much knowledge. So I think nobody can successfully argue that this not being taught will lose status. But I think lots of teachers will feel slightly worried that they will not have as much knowledge or as much insight or as much resources on them.
Sorry to cut you, and I know you're not speaking about yourself personally, you're speaking hypothetically. I would argue then how dare you as a teacher ever say to a child or anybody that life is an ongoing learning process? Because if you're not open to that exposing, and one of the things I wanted to say before about the rebuttals, I think the most devastating and destructive rebuttals are the quiet, indirect ones, not the comments that you get, but the defensiveness, the body language, the reluctance to engage, and the unconscious reluctance to engage. And to my mind, if you are genuinely open to learning, that to me means that you are comfortable with the discomfort that comes with the challenge of learning. To me, true learning is when you're on the cusp of discomfort. So if you, and that's what we're doing for early years all the way through, you are supporting children to be on the cusp of moving beyond their comfort zone.
Absolutely.
And if you're not prepared to do that as an individual, then I don't think you can be involved in the really good conversation.
And I think what I'm trying to get across here is that we are all modeling conversations that we can then bring about in our own schools. So by me kind of playing this devil advocate's role,
no, I was there.
People to then say, oh, but actually this is the situation. So, you know, when people say, oh, well, I don't know that, like you say, learn it then, find out about it. There's no resources on there, go ahead and do it.
Can I make a suggestion? So that's exactly something that has plagued me while I've been working on curriculum review at the school. And one of a good useful thing I think to do is to connect with local universities and other organizations and other experts for your subject area. So for example, in Bristol, we're fortunate that we have a pilot project that my school is part of called the One Bristol Curriculum, that is funded by the local authority and pulls together experts, historians and other experts to actually review the curriculum of the pilot schools involved in the project. I see someone's put in the comment that museums are there to support as well. So it is about acknowledging that you haven't got all the answers, and then as you've already said, reaching out to others that could help, but finding the right people to reach out to, I think.
I wanted to relate to this issue around sort of racial literacy and lifelong learning, and to pick up some of the questions that have come through around how do we embed this right at the beginning of a teacher's journey as well, because I think there's a huge lack of confidence among teachers, especially young teachers who might actually be more awake to some of these issues, but less confident as to how the education system works. So that's one strand, is initial teacher education. But also we are very restricted, no matter what we do in our schools and what we do across groups of schools, we're very restricted by the kind of linear journey that we have to take children on towards exams. So how do we come at it also from the other end, which is how do we compel Ofsted and how do we compel exam boards to open up their thinking so that we do have to teach this and it is recognised. Has anyone got any experience around either end of those journeys on our lifelong learning?
In terms of supporting initial teacher training, that part at Cottam, we delivering sessions on unconscious bias, and the work we're doing is part of their program. So building it into your NQT program, your ITT program in the school, I think is crucial. We say it has to be part of the program because of the school that we have, the students that we have, the context that we have. It's absolutely crucial.
I want to kind of echo, sorry. Echoing Domini, I really feel strongly about that as well. For early years practitioners entering into the workforce, quite commonly they're young, they are coming out of college or perhaps out of sixth form. I'm also a secondary school teacher by qualification and taught childcare and health and social care. And I found when I was teaching that, what I was making sure that I was doing was preparing the workforce to work within the city and know that these are conversations that they were going to be having about racial difference and cultural difference as well, and really to check in with their own thoughts and feelings about different children and different families, not excluding the GRT, the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community as well, and recognising that they too are covered, by the Race Relations Amendment. so when we look at race and when we look at diversity, I think the workforce from the very get-go, when they come into early years, they have to be prepared to have that embedded and have a list of kind of a reading list, I would say. That was one of the things that I kind of recommended for students, just to also kind of upskill themselves in terms of other people's narratives, other communities' narratives within the locality. And there's a lot happening in Birmingham around community cohesion and working with other organisations. I know in the chat, Melanie mentioned museums, and that was a big thing for us as a setting, but also making sure that practitioners were doing additional things around their own knowledge base of localities and areas and pockets of Birmingham which weren't extremely racially diverse on both ends, areas that were very white or areas that were particularly, you know, very, very black. You know, what did we feel about those areas and why? Because we had to recognise that the children and families were coming from such a wide variety of places.
I think that also if you are committed to racial literacy as a whole school, I think that's impossible, particularly if the bulk of your staff are white and are most likely to lack the racial stamina for the conversations we're talking about here. I know that's a generalization, but that's definitely my experience personally and professionally. I think that a racially literate school is going to be conducting ongoing research and trialing and impact reviews of not just content and historical knowledge, but also pedagogy as well, so that they can regularly making sure that they are addressing where diversity is needed and decolonisation is needed and so on. So I think if you're a new teacher going into that type of culture, I think that can also reassure you that it's an ongoing learning process. And in terms of the point on the curriculum, I think that definitely Key Stage 4 and above, to get to it, we found from the Black Curriculum's point of view to address the exam boards directly in terms of challenging their content is very difficult. But maybe this is a bit idealistic, but I think if you've got the bulk of early years settings in school, you've got Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 taking advantage of the flexibility of the national curriculum, that momentum, that proving that it's right and it's needed, and it's effective and successful. I think that would put sufficient pressure on Key Stage 4 and above to change to change the content for the exam board.
I think also there was questions being asked about like who leads on this work, and we've talked quite a bit about you know, ensuring that there is a curriculum for adults as well within the school setting, so that we're not just waiting for somebody to do this work. I think one of the questions also that is important to address is what school governors' role is in this, because they are the schools, you know, they're the head teachers' employers basically, so they do have a lot of power to compel a school to address this. What do you think? I mean, I can answer part of this from my own governance experience, but do you have experience in your work of governors taking a lead on this and making sure that they've addressed this as part of the school's development plan?
At my school, I'd say yes. Our governors are really supportive. They don't really know how to go about leading the work, and it's been a long journey. It's been a long journey of getting them to see what the challenges of our school are, and that our school is not the same as it was 15 years ago, which is when they may have become governors, some of them 27 years ago. And the challenges are different, and therefore this work that we need to do is so important. So absolutely, the governors have seen that. I mean, I think it's been repeated, ongoing, demonstrating that to them, and why the work is so important. And we have or just about to hopefully appoint a new governor who will lead this work in conjunction with some of the other governors. So yeah, it's actually identifying a role within the governing body, I think. But I think the broader question about who should lead this work, I think, yeah, governors and senior leaders need to drive the direction, but it's actually really important that you galvanize a body of staff, sort of change makers who are really passionate. We at Cottam set up a BAME strategy group that's been running for the last 2 years, it's this year, every BAME member of staff has joined, regardless of their role in the school, along with many of our white teachers who are at the front line of delivering the curriculum. So we now have 30+ members of staff who want to actually lead our whole school drive to become an anti-racist school. And the broad range of roles represented in that group means that our support staff, as much as our teaching staff, can feel like that they're making a contribution to our work on decolonising the curriculum, and also our wide representation of BAME and white staff on the group mean that our staff can feel that they're working together on these issues, that it isn't just left up to our BAME colleagues or left up to the senior leaders.
If I can come in on that too, I think from a governor's point of view, I think to ask your school leadership to conduct a questionnaire and focus groups around one question. Do the students in your school feel that they have people in the school they can turn to hold safe, brave and open conversations about race? And then ask them to feedback on that, because to me that would start a significant conversation, a significant momentum for change. And obviously it'll make a lot of people feel uncomfortable in the room too, but ultimately that's the sort of information that I think starts the change from the top down.
I think, again, just to like model the conversations that we can get participants and people that have signed up to use, what we've got to think about in terms of the people that are out there saying, should I lead on this work if I'm white, for example? Is this an example of me using my own privilege? Is this something that I should be doing? And at BAMED, we've always said, you know, we want to work with as many people as possible and work with those people in as many ways as possible. And I've always said that, you know, it will need people opening doors. It will need people inviting us to the table. It will need people pulling out the chairs and then allowing us to sit down to be able to then say, right, now that you're listening. So yes, if you're white and you're listening, do the work too. Yes, if you're white and you're there thinking, should I be doing this? Yes, absolutely. Should you and could you encourage other people to get involved and be a part of the journey? Absolutely. I mean, I was told before starting as one of the co-founders of BAMED Network that if you do this work, you'll become unhirable. And, you know, I was actively told to really assess whether I want to be a part of this journey or not. 4 or 5 years down the line, we're a registered charity. We're holding creative conversations, courageous conversations for people. Thousands of people have signed up, all part of the grassroots movement. And I'm still hired. I've still got a job. It's all good, thankfully. What I'm saying is it will happen. And if you're white and you're thinking, should I do this? Do it, but inform yourself on what you're doing. Has anybody got any viewpoints on that?
Absolutely. I think galvanizing the white workforce in the early years has been really, really important in the work that I'm doing, and kind of getting people on board and checking in has been fine, but also just being bold enough to take that step and saying, Liz, this is happening in my early years setting. You know, am I okay to do this? I feel quite confident. I want to also bring this team member on board. And that has been really nice to see within the early years. And I do actually see change being made, and actually the allyship of white people in the early years actually taking on that role. I do think allyship is really important, but also there has to be an interconnectedness. So we have to keep the dialogue going all of the time, and also how we're turning that dialogue into action in the early years. I think one of the things that I've seen most notably, obviously since June to now, globally, we've seen what's happened and how racism has taken kind of center stage again after the murder of George Floyd. There was a real response to that, I think, within the early years in terms of just getting these conversations started. This hasn't really happened in that age bracket before. And when I say in that age bracket, not directly speaking to children under 5 about racism, but in terms of the sector and the workforce taking leads or taking the stance to say, do you know what, I'm ready to start looking at what we're actually doing now. I'm ready to start having these really open conversations. And also, as Ben has said, and as Domini has said, being uncomfortable, being willing to be uncomfortable, because these conversations are never, ever, ever easy, particularly for white practitioners in my experience. And having delivered a lot of webinars around things like, as I said, inclusion in the role play area, or looking at Black Boy Joy and drawing on some of the systemic things that are happening to Black men, letting practitioners think about, before those Black boys get out of the setting, they need to have a strong sense of self, because we know disproportionately how Black men are treated within society. So it's getting practitioners to really think about how those systemic things are impacting Black men when they are Black boys, when they are Black children. And that requires allyship. It requires that, particularly when we look at the workforce within the early years and how it's broken down racially, how many white practitioners there are. There are many more white practitioners than there are Black, Asian, minoritized, people. So it means that we require the workforce to get on board with these things and with this anti-racist agenda and program.
So just a little plug for our website. If you go to baymednetwork.com and click on the resources, we've got a document that was created by Professor Muna Abdi on how to be an ally. So have a look at that document if you're wondering, what can I do to be an ally? I'm here, I want to, but I'm not really sure. Also, just for us to consider the idea of teaching and diversifying needs to not just be stemmed across teaching about oppression and things that have gone wrong in minority ethnic organizations or lifestyles. And I always use this reference because I find it fascinating. I had a fire safety training, right, in school, where all of us were in the hall, CPD sessions, when we could actually brush shoulders against each other. And the start of the CPD session was a house burning down. So the video clip that was being shown to us was a house burning down. And I paused for a second and I spoke to the CPD deliverer at the end, and I said, did you need to convince me that fire was bad? Did I need to be told before, we got on with the training session that fire is bad and you guys need to take this seriously? And I think that's what we need to reference here with curriculum and diversification of curriculum. I don't just want more units on slavery. I don't want just more units on the Silk Road. I don't just want more units on things that have gone wrong for people that look like me and Domini and Liz and whatever. What I want is for you to highlight where we've influenced worlds, where we've influenced strategies, where we've influenced medicine, where we've influenced science, where we've influenced art. I want you to show people that representation isn't for me. And in your 99.9% white British school, you need it more than an East London school where it's 99.9% South Asian, for example. Because guess what? Nobody will need to question whether they know the distinction between Diwali, Eid, Hanukkah, and Christmas. They will. The schools where there isn't diversity, they won't know the difference. I won't have colleagues come up to me and say to me, Amjad, I've ordered you a halal meal, but what wine would you like with that? No, I don't drink either. So it's that kind of, let's talk diversity through enriching diversity. Ben?
Amjad, I completely agree with you, but I think it's more, the point is it needs to be deeper than that, because I think the students and the staff to begin with, the leaders, the staff and the students need to know why that situation is as it is. Why is it that we're having to argue for that type of content? Because my understanding and belief is that if you know how knowledge, that the power of knowledge has been constructed and why it's been perpetuated, if you can undercut that, then representation makes sense, and you can actually do something really powerful with that diverse content, because I think that what you're talking about, which, as I said, I do agree with, but I think there's a danger of that we inject that more diverse content for the children and the staff to engage with, but particularly the staff, because the moment you are speaking about something that's beyond your culture, beyond your racialized position, you are having a conversation about race, you are having a conversation about culture, and I think that just having that content, the positive and certainly to outweigh the negative, I think is key. But if you don't have the tools, if you don't have the understanding, then you won't be able to share those tools and that understanding in terms of from a racial literacy point of view.
And I think what's vital about this is the rigor argument comes back in terms of as a professional. I mean, I'm a Senko by trade. I lead on inclusion in schools. SEND has existed for as long as education has existed, and yet teachers are still not 100% comfortable in how to manage SEND and how to deliver best for SEND students, blanketing them, obviously. So it's the idea of lots of people will be more comfortable in thinking, right, can I diversify a unit of work rather than the deeper construct? And that's where education, like courses and all of those CPD sessions, need to come in. And like Domini said, the one thing that's really, really resonated with Domini is that this has been ongoing work for years. This isn't just a flash in the pan moment from the George Floyd incident. This is repeated cyclical work. Domini, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you and Ben have both said, and a comment in the chat function about how, you know, as a Black student, hearing that you're constantly a victim is not empowering, which I do agree with. But I also, I think, understand where Ben's coming from around, I think that teachers have to feel confident to have the racial literacy to challenge colonial and racist narratives and stereotypes at every given opportunity, because they have to unseat that worldview or Western worldview of looking at history, because if they don't unseat it, then you can't create, you know, real sustainable change, and that is hard for teachers, because it requires a historical and sociological level of knowledge, and that's not quick or easy to achieve. But I think that without that, you know, I think that we're just not getting to the root. I think, for example, I'll give some examples. Things like, you know, in an English lesson, you look at Victorian literature, and do you look at how Black people were represented in Victorian times through that literature? You know, when you look at the rates of different health conditions in health and social care, do you look at it from a race perspective? You know, more controversial examples in politics, the anti-Semitism investigated by the Labour Party, in the Labour Party, recent terrorist attacks carried out in the name of Islam and subsequent racist attacks on Muslims. You know, if we don't feel confident and we don't feel we have the racial literacy to discuss these issues, then we're doing the students a disservice, because they're talking about them anyway, sometimes from really dubious internet sources. And so we've got to be willing to have those difficult conversations with students as well, and not run away from them out of fear.
Excellent. Right, we're gonna wrap it up there. I'm gonna give each of the panel members just 30 seconds just to summarize overall, and then I'm going to hand over to Penny after that just to explain what our next courageous conversation is about. Just as a summary, and it's important for me to highlight this as a steering group member of BayMed, that BayMed network has never solely been about people of color. Hence, the diversification of curriculum is also not just about people of color per se. So we've got Romani Gypsy, we've got the Jewish experience within there as well that can look like any other person that's part of the white male Eurocentric model in terms of aesthetically. So it's understanding the distinctions between diversity and knowing what diversity is. So Liz, quick summary of stuff.
For me, we need to start from a place of joy. We need to start from a place of empowering children, making them feel proud of who they are, particularly kind of getting into and leaning into difficult conversations so that we can think about how we can effectively diversify the EYFS, how we can decolonize it, but also how we can create an environment where all practitioners feel like they can recognize the strengths of what diversity brings, the strength of what multiculturalism brings, and also the strengths of our local communities and how they can aid children under 5 in developing a great sense of self.
Thank you, Liz.
For me, I think that the key is to understand racial power dynamics from a personal point of view, to understand your racialized position where you stand in the power dynamics of society and the wider world, who it is that's taken the power from you or is keeping the power from you, who indeed is giving you the power that you have, and from that discovery, that journey of self-discovery, I think it's about teaching that to the children that you teach, obviously at an age-appropriate level, in terms of where is the power, how did it get to that point, and as Dominique was speaking about, how do you dethrone it, how do you disempower those structures? To me, follow the power.
And Dominique?
I think I want to summarize by talking about from the early years through to the end of secondary, and the fact that flow is so important, and looking at the work all the way through. And I think that the best people in the education sector that have the ability to do that are our MATs, because our multi-academy trusts typically run from early years all the way through to the end of A level, and having that real broad sense of mapping out how this work is being done across the key stages, I think could be really powerful. The way that we map out our SMSC curriculum, for example, and I just want to add, the reason why it's so important is because by the time students get to secondary school, and I know Liz has touched on this before, the self-esteem, the lack of self-esteem in Black boys in particular is so evident, and that has been formed from a very young age, and it's a real challenge to support our young people. And then as a consequence, they fall foul, as we know, of so many issues in terms of sanctions and discipline and so on. And so I think that the work early on has to be done, and then all the way through has to be sustained. And I do think our CEOs and our MATs, and from the top down, like Ben said, it has to start there.
Thank you all for your time, for the effort. A lot of effort's gone in preparing. I know that the panelists all took some time to read and prepare and to get to know each other. Thank you all for joining us and for your contributions in the chat and in the questions. That's a wrap for this session. Our next session will be towards the end of January, dependent on what chaos we're going back to in schools and whether it's appropriate for schools colleagues to take part in another conversation so soon. But we're planning our next one, which will be around the relationship that schools have with the wider community. We thank you all. If you want to pick up the recording of this, it will be mailed out to anyone who's attended, and it'll also appear on our website, which is www.bamednetwork.com. And we will stick around for a little while, but please do feel free to leave, have your dinner, do what you need to do, and thank you to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you all.